we were going to go live today around 2:30-ish. And I just came back from the East Coast, and so I'm a little, is it jet lagged? I don't know. I slept a lot, but it's just tiring. You come back and you get that crisp, cool weather in the East Coast. You know, the leaves are starting to turn. You're walking all over the place because it's flat and walkable over there in Cambridge and, on the East Coast. And then you come back here and we are in the middle of I guess they call it Indian summer. It's in the 80s in Northern California today. So, I this is one of the last times you can wear a seersucker jacket and not look like a sucker. And, I got a seersucker jacket. And when I lived on the East Coast and it was always hot and muggy, my friend Richard would have his seersucker jacket on. I said, "Hey, there's Mr. Seersucker." And then when Dianne Feinstein, when she passed, in some of the biographical reports, she got together with a bunch of women, and it was hot, and she bought them all seersucker jackets or suits that they would wear. And so I've got seersucker in my mind, but it just wasn't the right time. I was going to bring it to Boston, hoping that they would have some kind of Indian summer thing. They didn't. And it was cold. And I come back here, and of course, it's 80 degrees, approaching 90 in some parts of Northern California. And, it's a bad thing, though, when it's October 18th and it's this balmy, seersuckery weather, because that means earthquakes. And today we had an earthquake in Northern California. It was based on around Bethel Island, Stockton, Solano County. I guess it's in the Delta region. And they've got this new thing now with your cell phone where they will alert you about earthquakes, and it's just a 4.4. All right. So if you're not like right there, you're not going to feel it. But there was this jolt. I got a bigger jolt from my phone than I did from the actual earthquake, right? The jolt from my phone was so so jarring. Like I thought that was like a 5.5. And it was only alerting me about a 4.4 about 50 miles away from me. And it's a take cover. It was kind of sensationalistic, but I survived it. I survived the alert system, but thank goodness we have that now. I mean, everyone's recognized that cell phones are it. You're not going to get people tuned into television or radio for the emergency broadcast system. So now they're including cell phones, and I got it. It works. And I was alarmed. But recall when the big earthquake came, I believe in 1989, the Loma Prieta quake. It was around this time. Around the time, baseball, the Giants were playing the A's. And that's when, I think that was a 7. That's when you start working 4s and 5s. Yeah, that you'll get a little shake, You get a little shake, and that's concerning. But when it gets to 7, structures can be impacted. In certain instances, I suppose 5, will get you, some damage, or some damage can occur. It's not totally insignificant. But generally speaking, you survive the 5s, the 6s, borderline, once you get to 7, once you roll a 7, some bad stuff can happen if things aren't tied down, if things aren't retrofitted, et cetera, et cetera. So I have not heard anything saying that this was a bad situation in Northern California. The worst, of course, was the alert system alarming me while I was doing something contemplative. Anyway, welcome to Emil Amok's Takeout, my takes on all things considerable. We do this show, once a day. We come on, we talk about stuff. I'm a career broadcaster, a radio guy, a TV guy. And this is just a way to talk about stuff on my mind, and maybe it's stuff on your mind. You can catch us live here, wherever you're watching this, on Twitter at Emil Amok, on YouTube at Emil Amok1, on Facebook at emilguillermo.media. And then you can catch the repeats on amok.com, sort of on demand. You can get it on demand in all the other places, but you can get it on my site, amok.com. That's easy enough. What a day today. President Biden is in Israel. And that's, of course, today, the real significance of this day is it's October 18th. And, October is Filipino American History Month. And the thing that makes October Filipino American History Month, really, I mean, a lot of things happen in October. Like Larry Itliong's birthday is in October. Emil Guillermo's birthday is in October. And this is the first year I copped to being 118 years old. Check out my column on amok.com or on the ALDEF blog, Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. But this is the day, the reason why October is Filipino American History Month. It's because the Filipinos were first. And I'll get to that in a second. All right, I'll talk about that. My ALDEF blog goes into detail about why October 18th is so special. And I'll talk about that. But I want to talk about Joe Biden going to Israel today. I mean, the Secret Service, there were reports about how they're just scrambling to keep him safe. I think it takes guts. I think this is the thing about Joe Biden. You doubt whether or not he can do the job. You doubt whether or not he is, virile enough. What is that the term? Is it virality? Is it his vitality? Is his vigor? Is it his ability to just be the adult in the room? I think this is the thing about Joe Biden that makes him kind of special right now. When you put Biden out there doing this kind of courageous thing, like going out to Israel and speaking to the country and Netanyahu and just being there, being that presence. Meanwhile, what are the Republicans doing? The leader of the Republican Party is in all sorts of legal hot water. 91 felony counts. Four or five different legal cases all at once. That's not a leader. That's not even a Republican Party worth talking about as governing the nation. And then you have the fiasco in the House with Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan, who you really shouldn't call. I mean, I've learned this, just observing politics, but also running for little local things and organizations. You don't call a vote. You don't run for anything unless you got the votes. That's kind of elementary. Otherwise, it's just kind of an embarrassment, right? So Jim Jordan didn't get the votes yesterday on the first ballot, didn't get the votes today on the second ballot, got fewer votes. And now we're not sure what's going to happen, but we do know that it shows that the House is, or actually all of Congress is incapacitated because the Republicans can't lead. The Republicans can't get 217 votes to get a Speaker of the House so that the government and the legislative branch can function. And so it can act in light of all these things that are happening in the world. Israel, Ukraine, the impending financial crisis in the U.S. I mean, we've kicked that can down the road for just a few weeks. The U.S. Can run out of money. Congress has to go to work. And this whole thing about not being able to get the votes, and you can understand why Jim Jordan's not getting the votes. Jim Jordan's not getting the votes because why would you give one of the top jobs in Congress, who is really spitting distance from the presidency, he's like third or fourth in line as Speaker. Why would you would give a guy like Jordan, who would rather tear down the government, who was in on January 6th, who is the House proxy for Donald Trump. I mean, it would be really a major turn for the worse here in the United States if Jim Jordan were elected Speaker of the House. Much better to have a conservative who has a respect for the institution and maybe a bent toward bipartisanship. So they're talking about a number of solutions. They're not ready to let the Speaker pro tem right now, Patrick Henry. They're not ready to give him some power so that they can function. But I think that's where it's headed, right? That's where it's got to be headed. And so thank goodness Jordan was not elected on the second ballot today. And he doesn't even have the votes that Kevin McCarthy had, because at least Kevin McCarthy had, he had built up some loyalty with folks, who were Republicans, got some people elected. So he had good reason to think, oh, maybe I can, eke out a win if I had some time. It turned out to be an embarrassment for McCarthy as well. And what an embarrassment if McCarthy ends up getting his job back because he's the only good option the Republicans have. Or if they feel like he's the only good option after Matt Gaetz of Florida really did the unthinkable, 2 weeks ago and called the question to get rid of McCarthy. And he did. I mean, and that's how, when McCarthy gave up all his power and allowed renegades like Gaetz to do that, that was it. That made him kind of ineffectual. Anyway, the United States is, when you think the United States is falling apart, then you have Joe Biden going to Israel, and thank goodness. He's an adult. He's gone there. And what a test for Biden. He's there when you have this big bomb blast go off in the hospital and the conflicting claims of Israel and Hamas pointing fingers. But now it seems that Biden had information from the Pentagon, information from his own Defense Department saying that the cause of the bomb blast in the Gaza hospital was not from Israel, but Hamas, some kind of Palestinian group. And, they have very non-precise type of weapons. So they're just, lobbing things, trying to create some kind of havoc, not really pinpointing a target. So it's plausible. There's also technology that shows that the origins were not from the IDF, from the Israelis. So I think this gets to the question. Oh, who is this here? We don't want this person here. So, I think it gets to the basic question about who are we dealing with when we talk about Israel and Hamas. We know Israel, right? The country, they feel like, the Zionists feel like this is their homeland. They're going to defend their right to be there. All right. We get that. The government of Israel, right? But who is Hamas? And I think people don't understand that Hamas is the ruling faction in Gaza, but they don't represent all. They don't represent all Palestinians. But they are the ruling faction right now. But does that mean they are, the authority that everyone acknowledges and it adheres to? I mean, it's like, look, in the United States, when Trump was president, he was president. But does everyone, adhere to, oh, Trump is the guy. He's our president. Well, in a general sense, but when he does something rogue or something wrong, there is opposition. And I think what isn't coming across is that Israel is Israel, and and they are generally unified, but Hamas does not represent all of Palestine. And when you realize, when you hear from Hamas leadership, when in conversations and interviews they've done in the past, and they say that their goal is essentially genocide, I mean, how can you take them seriously? Especially after the attacks. The attacks were evil. You can't like cut them any slack and say, oh, well, yeah, well, you know, look at what Israel's done to the Palestinians. What? There should be no equivacy. Is that a right word? One should not be equivocal on this. That what Hamas did was wrong and should be condemned. And that's where we're having problems, because a lot of people want to stand up and say, yeah, but I'm standing up for the Palestinians, and I'm a person of color. And, you know, the Palestinians, they deserve our support. Yes, the Palestinians deserve our support, but not Hamas. And there is a difference. Because as I said in my column in the Inquirer.net, I'm a pacifist. There's got to be a road out. And a lot of people think that there's no road out. I wrote my friend who is in Israel, a Filipino American who has lived in Israel the last 10 years. And he wrote me, and I just said, today he's having an Hamas dinner party in his neck of Israel. He's up to the north. They're not as under siege as the South. But let's face it, you live in Israel, you're under siege. And he said that he expects to eat well, drink some good wine, and share stories that will bolster our collective spirits. Great, unified, and motivated spirits exist throughout the country. And he says he and his wife are pulling security duty there. And when I suggested, isn't there a way toward peace? And he says that there can be no peace when your opposition wants to see you dead. And that is really the thing that you have to realize before you begin to take sides. That Hamas's mission is essentially the genocide of the Jews. And they feel that there was a leader of Hamas who was on MSNBC, a recording. Lawrence O'Donnell played a clip. He said that the Jews are for life. You know, we Muslims, we believe in sacrifice. Almost suggesting that the idea of killing your own people, killing or bombing your own facilities, you know, when I heard that, it made perfect sense. If the idea is that you want to sacrifice, here's the leader of Hamas saying, if you're, Islamic, we'll help you sacrifice. It's like Islamic affirmative action. So the idea of Hamas or a Palestinian, pro-Arab group, pro-Muslim group bombing a facility makes perfect sense. And then blaming the Israelis to show some kind of pretext. So this is where we are now, when you can't believe anybody, because if you have a distrust for the news, you're worried about, well, what sources? Where am I getting, the information? So here's my friend my friend was writing this email to me. He says, he says, there's no, the massacre that occurred in the Israel communities brook no neutrality. The fear is that while world opinion seems in favor of Israel now, it will dissipate with mounting Gazan casualties. And he says, the fact is, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, however flawed it is. My friend is saying, we hope you have our backs. Because who are they fighting? They are fighting a group that will not give up until they see every Jew dead. Once you realize that, the moral stance is you stand with Israel. You stand with Israel. You stand with the pro-Palestinians who believe in peace. And believe me, there are people in Palestine who believe in peace. I mean, they're out there. And I was reading one column today, Muslim Americans Against Hamas. This is by Zainab Khan. She wrote it a couple days ago in the Wall Street Journal. She says, as a child in Afghanistan, my father watched his female cousin get hacked to death in a so-called honor killing. He came to America so his daughters could grow up without such threats, and he raised us to abhor senseless violence. I was 18, living in Chicago on September 11, 2001, a day that revealed that the extremism my father fled could reach the U.S. When ISIS burst onto the scene several years later, committing atrocities in the name of my faith, I felt compelled to counter its message and help Muslim Americans show that we are very much part of American society. With a group of fellow Muslims, I established the Muslim American Leadership Alliance in 2015 to celebrate Muslim American heritage and promote individual freedom and diversity. Our first project was recording the personal narratives of Muslim Americans in partnership with the Library of Congress. Right? I mean, all good. They launched Muslim American Heritage Celebration, periods, supported by acclaimed leaders such as designer Naeem Khan. These efforts were designed to celebrate our community's advancement in the U.S. For years, we've been successful. Last week, however, our progress came to a standstill as Muslim leaders failed to respond adequately to Hamas's massacre in Israel. President Biden said in an October 10th speech that there are moments in life when pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. There's Biden talking like an adult, right? That's the way you got to view this, through a moral lens. And you got to hold Israel accountable too. They've got to play by the rules as well. So whatever they do next, I mean, they're talking ground war and they have airstrikes. And you heard President Biden today say, look, you can have rage, but don't let the rage get the best of you. That's what he said. That's what Biden said. So I think there was a kind of moderating tone to the anger. Let's get back to this. Here's this op-ed again by this Muslim American. Hamas's attack, Biden said, was a moment for the United States to come together to grieve with those who are mourning. American Muslims should have followed the president's lead by denouncing the terror group's attack as an affront to the sanctity of human life, according to our faith. With a few notable exceptions, prominent Muslims chose instead to make excuses and equivocate. There's that word, equivocate. What's that mean? That means they're like, not be strong and say that was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. Equivocate is saying, well, it was evil, but, what has Israel done for toward the Muslims? I mean, that's trying to speak out of both sides of your mouth, equivocating. Back to this op-ed. The U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations refused to condemn Hamas. The only two Muslim women in Congress, Reps Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, were so equivocal about Hamas and hostile toward Israel that the White House press secretary felt compelled to call their comments repugnant. Ivy League academics fueled the fire as demonstrators celebrated the massacre. I mean, that's what I experienced when I was in Boston last week. That Harvard was unable to come out with initially with a reasoned and strong response, allowed some student groups to go out there and say things that blamed Israel, and then the university had to come back and say, well, wait a minute, it was bad. I mean, everyone is tiptoeing. No one wants to just come out and condemn what happened with the Hamas attack, except Joe Biden. Joe Biden took the stand. Thank goodness for that. Back to this op-ed. My organization typically doesn't weigh in on headlines, but felt it was necessary this time around. When we posted an Instagram expressing solidarity with our Jewish and Israeli friends, the post received few likes, and most people who commented on it expressed solidarity with Palestinians rather than the Jews. A few things led Muslims to fail in this critical moment. The first was an irrational ideological fixation on Zionism, which has no effect on most Muslims. The second was an activist-fueled dehumanization of Israelis. Americans are horrified by Hamas and see many Muslims respond either by saying nothing or by blaming Jews for the rape, beheading, and kidnapping of their people. In a single weekend, extremists have taken our identity hostage, tarnished our reputations, and endangered our families. Suspicion of Muslims has returned with terrible consequences. And this woman goes on to talk about something in Chicago. So there's Islamophobia happening. And also there's anti-Semitism that's happening on the part of the people who, are taking the stand of the Palestinians. And back to Ms. Khan's op-ed. She says, to my Jewish friends, I'm sorry. My organization remains committed to protecting you and your heritage without compromise. To my fellow Muslims, we hear the cost of remaining silent. It will take years to restore our good name. It's time to get to work to build peace. And this is by Zainab Khan, who is the head of and the founder of the Muslim American Leadership Alliance. There are voices out there, Muslim voices who are anti-Hamas here in America. And there are Muslim voices in Gaza who were working with the Israelis. And they were living and coexisting. As I said, Hamas may be the leading faction in Gaza, but they do not represent all Palestinians. They just don't. So that was one op-ed that you should be aware of. That's in the Wall Street Journal, Zainab Khan. And then the other one is written by Daniel Pipes, who's an old historian and is also the president of the Middle East Forum. And, you hear a lot of things right now that are so polarizing. So you see Biden come out strong, goes to Israel, and but he also moderates, because he said to Israel today in his speech there, he said, don't let your rage get the better of you. Even with 9/11 in America, we made some mistakes. And if this is Israel's 9/11, you got to keep your rage in check and do the right thing. Now, here's what Daniel Pipes said in the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's important to hear these voices, Because if you don't hear these voices, you just think that it's, oh, well, it's the Israelis against the Palestinians. And especially if you're of a younger generation, you think, oh, well, the Palestinians, they've been screwed. And so we got to support them. The Israelis, they're responsible. And I'm not saying that, the airstrikes on Gaza aren't going to hurt the Palestinians. They probably will. And that's why the Israelis have to show some restraint. That's what Biden was saying. Have some rage, but also you have to show some restraint. And I was just reading the headlines just a second ago. It said that some of the humanitarian things are being the things that were creating hardships are being lifted. So when we get back to that kind of thing, because right now, if the Israelis continue bombing and they do the airstrikes and the ground war, Gaza becomes unlivable. And then, some people say they visited there, say it's pretty unlivable now. But then what after the airstrikes? So there's a balance here. Israel can show their rage, but within reason, humanitarian-wise. But anyway, here's Daniel Pipes. He says, everyone seems to agree that no good outcome is possible in Gaza. They're wrong. It's possible for a decent Gaza-led administration to emerge, which could make autonomy and even statehood possible. Now, that's the most optimistic thing I've read among op-eds on this issue the last couple of days. That may seem unlikely given the deep and long-standing anti-Zionism in Gaza. In 67 Gazan school books taught arithmetic with problems like, you have 5 Israelis, you kill 3 of them, how many Israelis are left to be killed? That's dark. But over the past 15 years, Gazans have endured something monstrous and possibly unique in human experience. Exploitation by their rulers as cannon fodder for public relations. And this is what I was talking about. When Hamas says, oh, well, we Muslims believe that, dying, sacrificing is a good thing. And we're going to help them by bombing our own people. And that's over the last 15 years. Back to Pipes' editorial. Tyrants treating their subjects as expendable to attain battlefield victory is routine. Think Wagner Group prison recruits dying in Bakhmut, Ukraine. Hamas, however, uses civilians to score propaganda points. It attacks Israel to provoke retaliation, correctly expecting that the bombs, destruction, and death will bring Iranian approbation, Islamist support, Muslim solidarity, and leftist sympathy. After each attack, the narrative about culpability invariably shifts from Hamas to Israel. This is the perspective, the viewpoint that you need to look at the hospital bombing. That it is, especially when you have this pointing fingers and then Israel has the evidence, and the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, has the evidence that shows that this was a Palestinian weapon, or it was, perpetrated by the Palestinians. Much evidence suggests that most Gazans don't want to serve as pawns in an obsessive and illusory jihad against Israel. Why suffer for a lost cause? These people profess Islam and claim to be religious, but they slaughtered people, one Gazan observes. Polls find overwhelming support among Gazans for the statement that, quote, Palestinians should push harder to replace their own political leaders with more effective and less corrupt ones. A July poll by the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy found that 62% of Gazans wanted to keep a ceasefire with Israel, and half wanted Hamas to stop calling for Israel's destruction. So if you want to know about Hamas, that should tell you what Hamas have. Because most people, when they say, oh, Hamas, I remember reporting about Hamas back in the 80, 89, 90, 91. Hamas was doing things for the, getting in the good graces of the community. They were seen as kind of like the good bad guys, right? Militants who were helping the sort of like someone said, oh, kind of like the Black Panthers. Oh, I don't know if I'd go that far, or I don't know if I'd cast the Black Panthers in that way. I think the Black Panthers were better, in other words, better than Hamas. But you see, Hamas has its motives, and it's not necessarily pro-Palestinian. For years, Gazans have voted with their feet. Quote, Hamas has billions of dollars in investments in many countries while people in Gaza starve to death and migrate in search of work. Anti-Hamas activist Amor noted last year. Interviewed in September while waiting in long lines to leave, Gazans expressed despair. Quote, all those who are seeking to immigrate want a dignified life. They are prepared to die. I know I'm risking my life, but I want to leave dead or alive. Gazans led normal lives under Israeli rule. Unsurprisingly, they want to do so again. Gaza and the West Bank in the 1970s, historian Ephraim Karsh recounts, constituted the fourth fastest growing economy in the world, ahead of such wonders as Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea, and substantially ahead of Israel itself. Medicine, electricity, schools, literacy all flourished. Gazans benefited from refrigerators and running water. All this implies that on seizing control of Gaza, Israel can reasonably expect to find plenty of residents ready to work with the new authority to create an administration that could return them to normal life. Israel failed to find decent partners during its previous occupation when it made an effort to cultivate friendly relations with Gazans and handed the territory to Yasser Arafat. Hamas now has done Israel's work. Where is Gaza's Konrad Adenauer? Says Daniel Pipes, president of the Middle East Forum. But as you can see there, put the blame on Hamas. And it's surprising to me that in view of the terror that was unleashed by Hamas, that people would be equivocal about condemning Hamas, except that they're confused and they think that Hamas represents the Palestinians. They do not. They do not. So I think that's important. And the more voices we hear telling the truth, you get bogged down with the shots of, the rubble and the bombing and the step by step of war. And we sometimes forget, who does Hamas represent? And I think what got me when, I'm, as like I said, as a pacifist, I'm looking for a way to peace. But when my friend said, how can there be peace when your enemy wants you dead? Well, that just kind of stopped me cold. And yet we have all these people equivocating about how to view Hamas. So read the Muslim and the scholarly anti-Hamas writing out there. Mind you, Israel's got to be held to the same standard. I mean, they can't go overboard. And you heard Biden today say, hey, don't overreact. We did during 9/11, the U.S. made some mistakes. Don't make the same mistakes. I think that was helpful. All right. I want to wind up because it happens every year, and I talk about October 18th. October 18th means something if you're in October, if you're an Asian American Filipino, This is Filipino American Heritage Month. It's all, we have it all to ourselves now, because Hispanic Heritage Month goes from September 15th to October 15th. It's all ours now. And it sets up perfectly for October 18th, because this is the day that Filipinos were first. On October 18th, 1587, the first Filipinos from Asia landed in America, and they didn't grab a thing, at least not for themselves. They gave the Indians food and clothing as peace offerings, as their fellow Indios, they were called. I mean, because the Filipinos were called Indians according to these logs in the Spanish journals for the boats. They were just working stiffs for the Spanish colonizers, these Filipinos. And please note that 1587 is 33 years before 1620. That would be the much ballyhooed time of the Pilgrims, right, who landed on a rock in Massachusetts and forgot it first belonged to the Indians. I mean, you know, we still make much ado of those Mayflower folks in November. And what about the first Filipinos on the other side by 33 years? Do you get Filipino food on Thanksgiving? Well, unless you're Filipino. You know, adobo, pancit, vegan lechon? Nope. I'm telling you, this is a significant thing. 33 years before the Pilgrims. And few people know anything about this. I mean, I went to a Harvard Asian American alumni, so I talked about it to people. I said, did you know that October 18th, 1587, it's the day that Pedro de Unamuno, sailing for Spain, landed on Morro Bay, which is close to San Luis Obispo on the central coast of California. And for the Filipino American National Historical Society, it's the main reason October is Filipino American History Month. And no one really knows this. Now, you say, Emil, you're making this up, right? I mean, this is just part of your fantasy. No, this was part of scholarly research, Unamuno's logs, published in UCLA's Amerasia Journal in 1996 by Eloisa Gomez Bora, who was a librarian and a trustee of Fonz. And she made the case for the Filipino presence, telling the story of how Unamuno was part of an expedition led by Francisco Galli in 1584. Galli died. Unamuno lost the two ships he inherited after he took a side trip to Macau. He was stranded there in Asia. He needed to buy another boat, and he did. He bought a single-deck, three-masted vessel named Nuestra Senora de Buena Esperanza, Our Lady of Good Hope. And his deckhands were mostly Filipinos. On July 12, 1587, they left for points east and were at sea until the end of the voyage, November 22nd, 1587, in Acapulco, New Mexico. But before then, there was this brief 3-day excursion between October 18th and 20th that turned out to be on the northern part of the California coast. Unamuno sailed with the Franciscan father Martin Ignacio de Loyola, the nephew of the founder of the Jesuit order. There were a few priests, a few soldiers. The logs reveal the presence of at least 8 Filipinos identified as Indios Luzones, or Luzon Indians from the northern Philippines, the island of Luzon. They were, jacks of all trade seamen, and too often they were just left off the logs of these boats. But here in the Unamuno's logs, they were present. And when I talked to her, she said, there they were on these early explorations and trade ships, often overlooked in these captain's logs, but in Unamuno's log, there was the mention Indios Luzones, documenting the presence of Filipino natives, and that was the proof. So, Indios appears 42 times And in 23 times, it was a reference to the native Californians encountered, but 19 times it described the Filipinos. And it mattered on October 18th because they landed in a place that the Unamuno called Puerto San Lucas. 12 armed soldiers led by Martin de Loyola, cross in hand. They're walking through in typical formation, and they claimed the land, took possession of the land for Spain, the King of Spain. And then on the second day, the 19th, 8 Filipinos go out there. They led a priest and 12 soldiers for further exploration. And on the third day, the 20th, they encountered violence. And there apparently was an effort to, the Indians kidnapped the ship's barber, and they traded a peace offering of food and clothing for the barber. And Bora said it was fine until the Indians tried to kidnap the barber again, and that's when the violent exchange ensued, and one unnamed Filipino was killed by a javelin. You know how hard it is to kill someone with a javelin? I mean, you really have to, it's like hitting the lottery, right? I mean, you're throwing the javelin, and you got to strike the guy, or, it's got to hit just right. But Filipino blood was spilled on American soil. And then by daybreak, Unamuno left October 21st for Acapulco. So the significance of the 3 days. The historian Bora said it's evidence of Filipino presence, too often obscured when historians fail to identify or differentiate among non-Europeans in the crew. And it makes sense. All right, the Filipinos were the deckhands. They were the crew, but they were there. And they may not have had real estate license to claim the land. They may not have had the power to claim the land. But they were first. And that's got to count for something. Like I said, you can win many a bar bet by saying, who are the first Asian Americans? And people would say, I don't know. Was it a Chinese guy crossing over, Alaska, those islands up there, the Bering Straits? Or was it, people may not know. Or they'll guess. But you'll probably get a few appletinis or whatever your drink is if you ask that question and get the wrong answer, and you say no. Filipinos were in North America first. They left empty-handed after 3 days in October in 1587, California, but they were there first. They didn't stay and create a community, but they stepped foot in North America and they spilled blood. And we remember the Filipinos for arriving on October 18th, this Filipino-American History Month. It's true. It's all true. Amerindia Journal, UCLA, in the 1990s, Eloisa Bora. And the Filipino-American National Historical Society has officially, it's Congress passed, I think they got a law to make it, or a proclamation, or more than a proclamation. October officially is Filipino-American History Month. And now we have it from all to ourselves through the rest of the month. And by October 25th, we have Larry Itliong's birthday. So I hope you enjoyed the telling of the 1587 story. Happens every year. It's also on the ALDEF blog, aaldef.org/blog. And history. it was a colonial story that was colonial Spain, but it could have been colonial Filipino. No, the Filipinos knew better. They weren't going to take the land from the Indians. They might have shared, but a colonized people dealing with other colonized people, or actually the Indians weren't well, they were colonized afterwards. But what if, I mean, have you ever wondered what if the Filipinos were able to, like, on that second day, cut a deal with the Indians because Pedro de Unamuno was a down on his luck, second-rate explorer. What was he going to do, right? What if they just say, "Go to Acapulco. We'll deal with this Morro Bay thing," and then he gladly goes to Acapulco because there was more money, more spices. He didn't know this land near San Luis Obispo and Morro Bay would be worth millions. The Filipinos didn't know that either. Anyway, the story, the Filipino-American story. Anyway, if you missed any or all or part of this, hey, go back, use your finger wherever medium platform you're on. You can go back and get the, go to the beginning. I'll post this on amok.com. I think it's just important, getting back to the main story of the day. The hospital, there's evidence now. It's our Defense Department, U.S. Defense Department evidence saying that the bomb wasn't perpetrated or set off by Israelis, but by Palestinians, whether an offshoot or whether it was Hamas. And it's perfectly in line with the Hamas MO, which is sacrifice your own people. Commit to a public relations war that when people see how bad things are, they begin to shift the blame from Hamas to Israelis. And then they miss the point about what's going on, and they blame the Israelis for all Palestinians. The bottom line, though, is there are Muslim voices, Palestinian voices who are anti-Hamas. And once you understand there are reasonable people who want a two-state solution, there are reasonable people who want to live in coexistence, that Hamas is not the be-all, end-all for many Gazans, then maybe we can approach this with some sense of integrity and truth and move toward peace, because that should be the objective. And if you're like many people who think, oh, that's it, there's no way we can get to peace, I just read you a couple things from a Muslim American and one from the historian Daniel Pipes, suggesting there are ways out. It will be difficult because ultimately it does become a public relations kind of war. I mean, look at Harvard and look at those student groups and people of color and people in academic communities who will say, remember the Palestinians were screwed, we're screwing them again, all these airstrikes. The sympathy goes toward the Palestinians, and then we end up with both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia at the same time, which sounds like a Trumpian thing, right? The kind of division that we see fomented by MAGA types. But that kind of thing can happen if we're not careful. I mean, right now, when you have different people pointing fingers at each other, oh, they did it. Who do you believe? I mean, this is the problem when you have siloed news sources that make it almost impossible to say, oh, yeah, this is a credible source. But, I'm dealing with mainstream sources. I mean, those two op-eds that I read to you earlier in the show, they were in the Wall Street Journal. That's certainly not some left-wing bastion. But one was a group of Muslim Americans trying to showcase Muslim American contributions. Is it any different than Filipino Americans trying to showcase Filipino American contributions? And the message that she had was, hey, look, this is no time to equivocate about Hamas's terror and how it was just wrong. But knowing how Hamas acts, this is their MO. This is the way they do things. To create that kind of division, to create a kind of sympathy away from Israel toward Hamas. And once you understand that Hamas's main goal is the genocide of the Jews, you say, how can anyone support them? They don't support all. I mean, they do not represent all Palestinians. It is possible to be pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. Very possible. But think of it this way. It's the only way we're going to get to peace. All right. Thank you for listening. Hey, back in, I think tomorrow, maybe I'll come back Friday. Maybe Professor Dan will come back and talk with us on Friday, I think. All right. Hey, I'm looking at it's near 90 degrees in Northern California. A perfect seersuckery kind of day. So I'm glad I got my seersucker on. I'm a seer and a sucker. We're here, generally speaking, Monday through Friday around 2 o'clock, 2:30-ish. Live, you can catch us live. This is the Emil Guillermo, the secret podcast, the mini talk show. Emil Amok's Takeout, my takes on all things considerable. Thank you for listening. Go to amok.com for the replays. You can catch us live if you go to YouTube at Emil Amok 1, Facebook at fb.com/emilguillermo.media, and then also on Twitter, now known as X, or X, formerly known as Twitter, at Emil Amok, EMIL, AMOK, and replays on amok.com. All right. Warriors are playing tonight. Nothing like a good basketball distraction. Go Jonathan Kuminga. All right. We meditate. We meditate because that was my saving grace during the pandemic. Meditation. It really was. And so, the loving kindness meditation, metta, M-E-T-T-A, metta, loving kindness. So, as I wish for me, I wish for you. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. And may you live with ease. Emil Guillermo here. Till next time. Mahal